All right, so welcome everyone to the MHCH Housing Justice Forum. My name is Bert Newton and I will be your host this evening as we talk about rezoning religious land for affordable housing. Making Housing and Community Happen, or MHCH, is a faith-rooted organization with participation from faith congregations from a variety of faiths. And we begin our gatherings often with a reflection from one of those traditions. So since I come from a Mennonite Christian faith tradition, I'm going to base my reflection on one of our revered texts, Ephesians 2:14-15, which reads, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and ordinances. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace." These verses speak of breaking down a dividing wall and abolishing ordinances. During the administration of the previous president, when there was a very prominent attempt to build a wall at our southern border, some of us used this passage about breaking down the dividing wall of hostility to counter it. Well, another dividing wall that is part of our history and still very much with us and is written as local ordinances is zoning codes. Municipal zoning has divided us. The first single-family zoning was created in 1916 in Berkeley, California, as part of a strategy to keep people of color out of a white neighborhood. It then took off like wildfire across the nation as a segregationist strategy. Rezoning religious land for affordable housing works against this dividing wall to help us build instead the beloved community of justice, grace, and mercy. MHCH has been working for housing justice in Pasadena for over 20 years. And for the past 3 years, we have been working to get religious land in the city rezoned for affordable housing. We have a congregational land team with experts in city planning and affordable housing development that works with faith congregations to prepare them to use their land for affordable housing. But the most common barrier we run into is that the zoning is not right. In Pasadena, approximately 10 churches have expressed interest in offering their underutilized land for affordable housing, but the zoning is not right for 9 of them. An affordable housing development in Pasadena needs at least 50 units to pencil out. So the zoning needs to get them to that density, or else this underutilized land will continue to be underutilized, and we will miss this opportunity for more affordable housing. We are in a severe housing crisis. Many people, especially Black and brown people, are being displaced from Pasadena due to the rapidly rising cost of housing. 12 public schools have closed since 2005, even while the population of Pasadena has increased, because families who send their kids to public schools can't afford to live here anymore. We need to build more affordable housing, but finding sites with the right zoning for it is the biggest obstacle. Congregational land not only gives us more sites, but it also spreads them more evenly throughout the city, working against exclusionary zoning, something that California cities are required to do by the state policy of affirmatively furthering fair housing, a state policy aimed at assuring racial justice in housing accessibility. While getting this zoning amendment has proved difficult in Pasadena, other cities are showing that it can be done. Seattle rezoned religious land across the city for affordable housing, and now it's starting to happen in California. Sierra Madre, the sleepy, bucolic town of 10,000 people right next to Pasadena, they did it. And so did Yorba Linda. Many cities in Southern California have recently included it in their housing elements. In Seattle, the Black churches led the way. And so this evening, we have with us 2 people from Seattle who will tell us how it was done and the pitfalls to avoid. We have Nick Welsh from Seattle's Office of Planning and Community Development, and also Donald King, President and CEO of the Nehemiah Initiative Seattle. Each one of them will speak, and then we will have time for questions. So let me first introduce Nick Welsh. Nick Welsh is a senior planner at Seattle's Office of Planning and Community Development. and he focuses on strategies to address displacement. He led Seattle's effort to expand the production of ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Nick also wrote legislation to facilitate affordable housing on faith-owned land and was instrumental in bringing a focus on racial and social equity into Seattle's 2035 comprehensive plan by developing the growth and equity analysis. Nick has a master's degree in urban and environmental policy and planning from Tufts University. So thank you for being here with us, Nick, especially since you're traveling in the East right now. We know you're 3 hours ahead of us. So thank you so much for coming. For the audience, if you have questions while Nick is talking, please put them in the chat. And then after Nick is done, I will read them so that Nick can answer them. So Nick, please tell us about rezoning religious land in Seattle.
Okay, thank you, Bert. Thanks for that intro, and not just of me, but a pretty moving introduction to what it is that you all are trying to do here. Let me know if you're not seeing my screen, but I'll assume you are, and I'll take you through just about a dozen slides that describe the work we did in 2020 and 2021 to rezone religious organization-owned property throughout the entire city of Seattle. The starting point here is that this tool arose because a bunch of faith organizations advocated for state legislation that was adopted by the Washington State Legislature in 2019 called Substitute House Bill 1377 that basically requires cities and counties to allow additional density for affordable housing on faith-owned land. The exact language in the bill is kind of, as I've captured it here on the slide, additional density. It does not define exactly what that is. It also does not define in what zones this should apply, or I guess more specifically, it doesn't identify zones where this requirement would not apply. And I'll get into more detail about how we've interpreted this. The focus on faith organizations for us at the city, and some of this is adapted from our presentation to our city council when we were proposing legislation. First is the state legislation itself requires us to focus on faith-owned land with this new tool that we were proposing and is now in effect. As you all know, the idea of supporting affordable housing and to support low-income neighbors is very aligned with the missions of faith organizations. And as it sounds like is also true in your community, there is a big opportunity here with the undeveloped or underdeveloped land that a lot of faith organizations have, in our case in Seattle. So because of the requirements in the state bill, we had a certain set of eligibility and affordability criteria and requirements that we built into our legislation. And we really looked to mirror those, both because we were following state guidance, but also because we were looking to make this tool as useful as possible for faith and housing stakeholders. I don't have slides on this, but Seattle has a pretty good history of faith organizations supporting affordable housing, at least half a dozen significant affordable housing developments that have been done on faith land, usually with city funding from the Office of Housing, in just probably the last 10 or 12 years, I would say. So the key requirements for this tool, which I will get to in a second, the sort of land use component, but the additional density is available for developments that meet these requirements. The property has to be, and this is again language from the state legislation, owned or controlled by a religious organization. All of the housing, 100% of the housing in the development must be income restricted. It can be rental or ownership housing. The income restriction is affordable for households that are earning no more than 80% of the area median income. Just for context, we have some other affordable housing programs in Seattle that set a limit at 60% of AMI. In fact, most of what the Office of Housing funds is at 80% or below, at 60% or below. Much of it is actually much lower at 0 to 30%. The exception to that is affordable ownership, which generally does go up to 80%. But 80% was set as the criterion in the state bill. And then the term of affordability is 50 years. And that is true even if the property is sold once or multiple times in the future. It's a covenant that's recorded on the title for the property. We developed this through engagement with several stakeholders. I won't say much here, in part because you're going to hear from one of the best ones who we worked with and who did a ton to support this legislation, and that's Donald. So the neighborhood-based efforts in the Central District is really referring to his work and leadership with the Nehemiah Initiative, but we talked with several other faith organizations, both individual institutions, churches, and others, as well as the Church Council of Greater Seattle, which represents a large number of organizations, and also affordable housing developers who have partnered with those organizations in the past and who would be most likely involved in any use of this tool. Because through our outreach, one of the things we heard was that faith organizations on their own, and I'm sure you all know this pretty well, are generally not just ready to go with all of the skill sets you'd need to become developers. They usually will, in the past, have or will be looking to partner with an affordable housing developer. Another theme that we heard, and this is something I imagine Donald might speak to, is that churches that we talked to in particular were eager to develop affordable housing for a number of reasons: to provide just general community support, also to provide direct support to their membership, many of whom might have been displaced because housing prices have risen so much, but that in many cases, the vision included more than just affordable housing. It also might have included worship space, other community spaces, other community needs. So that was part of our consideration as we developed the land use component of this. Just a little context on where faith organizations own land in Seattle. I think this resonates with what Bert said about that dispersed nature of the opportunity here. They're certainly located throughout Seattle. Every dot on that map is sort of probably a little faint to see on your screens, but that represents one parcel owned by a religious organization. The dots are scaled by the size of the property. So you can see some are very small, and that really represents, typical residential parcels of 3,000 to 5,000 square feet. And then some are very, very large. They exist in not just every neighborhood, but also across most zones that we have. And the key thing, again, as we were chatting about at the beginning of this, is that many of them are in single family zones, as you can see from the orange dots on this map. And I'll come back to that when I'm getting into the proposal, but just like any city, I imagine, changes to development in single family zones are always pretty contentious. The proposal that we have is tailored to specific zones. I'll walk through that in a moment. But generally how it works is the religious organization may have either their entire site or a portion of their site that may be underused, like a surface parking lot. And currently they have a zoning limit in this scenario. We're imagining a zoning height limit of 4 stories, and that would limit what they could develop on that site. And with this new tool, they do have now, because it's in effect, additional height and additional floor area that not only allows them to maximize the opportunity that they have to build housing on their property, in some cases make it just feasible to begin with when it might have been infeasible otherwise, but it also helps those organizations and their development partners compete more effectively for city funding for affordable housing. So these are the specifics of what is labeled here as a proposal, but again, this is now in effect in Seattle as of last year. And actually, the truth is, if you were to read the legislation, it's much more detailed and granular than just these broad zone categories, but I'll just sort of discuss them at this level, going row by row here. So in multifamily zones, there's a wide range in Seattle. Currently, development is between 3 and 8 stories, or can be, for redevelopment. And this would allow, basically in all cases, just one additional story for those zones. Similar in mixed use commercial zones, and a lot of our residential development actually happens in mixed use commercial zones in Seattle. Similar range of existing height. In those cases, because those zones tend to be located generally a little closer to transit in slightly more intensive urban center type of areas, we we implemented up to 3 additional floors. And so that change varied based on the height. The taller stories actually tended to get the smaller 1 floor increase. 3 stories was something we used in certain zones where it really maximizes the potential additional value that an upzone like this can have, mostly staying within the height limit for wood frame construction, really maximizing what projects can get up to that height. I go into detail about that if helpful, if there are questions. One thing I should have said probably a moment ago is we proposed, and I'll again walk through the scenarios a little more in a moment, but what you're seeing here on the screen covers all zones where we allow residential development. Obviously, the last row here is single family. So there are a handful of zones, mostly industrial, where we don't allow housing at all. So those weren't affected by this proposal. But otherwise, this applied citywide. So that's what you're seeing here. And this third row, zones that have a height limit above 85 feet, reflects the fact that we do have, obviously, our center city with very, very high height limits, in a few cases, even no height limit. But in most cases, those go up to 44 stories. The proposal adds some additional height and some additional floor area. For now, I'll just tell this group, we think it's highly unlikely that it will get used in those areas. There are some faith-owned properties there, but there are very, very, very few examples in our recent history of affordable housing built with public subsidy in a high-rise zone, meaning a zone with more expensive steel and concrete construction. So we wanted to implement this citywide and did. And so that includes those zones. The tool is there if anyone ever wants to use it, but we don't think it's where the most opportunity will come. On the other hand, single family zones, and our decision to include them in the scope of this was because we do think there's a real opportunity there. There's also such an exclusive nature to those areas. And thirdly, there's a lot of faith-owned property in them, as we saw in that map. So under existing base zoning and what was previous zoning for a religious property, the height limit is 3 stories. And the density limit for us it varies a little bit. There are a handful of zones that go down to 2,000 square feet of lot area per unit, but most are 5,000 square feet or more. So that's a very typical, even somewhat suburban, single family detached form of development that we have, covering about 2/3 of our land area, but actually about 3/4 of the land where we allow housing is zoned this way. So that's the existing zoning. But now with this new tool, in most cases, there's no change in height. There are some areas that would get up to 1 additional story. And the density limit comes down. So there's the opportunity to have more homes per lot. Again, all of these are affordable housing, every housing unit produced with this tool. And the opportunity here really is to expand sites where affordable home ownership might be possible. The city, through the Office of Housing, has an investment program in affordable home ownership, and often finding suitable sites, excuse me, is the limiting factor. So this is the opportunity we saw in those areas. So I'll, in a moment, just click through some examples that sort of help you all, and we use to help people visualize what this could mean. But the impact that we saw here was to help faith institutions make use of the property they own. And again, as Donald will describe, in some cases, there's a lot of land owned by these organizations, especially in particular communities. And they have a lot of reasons for thinking about how they might use and reuse that property in the future for a number of both positive and challenging needs that they may be facing. This tool, this additional development capacity, helps makes projects pencil. But another sort of under the radar benefit here is that it makes the regulatory process much more predictable. What that means in practice, and this project that's illustrated here is a perfect example, is that a lot of times what happens for affordable housing projects that do have limiting zoning and that need some sort of zoning relief in order to be financially feasible and or to have a competitive application to their funders, is that they need to change their zoning. And for us, we call that a contract rezone. Many of them go through this process that ends up taking usually a couple years, if not longer, a lot of money, because you're generally hiring an attorney and taking, using their time for a multi-year process. You have to go before our city's hearing examiner, which is sort of like a judge, and then ultimately go to the city council to get approval to change the zoning for your site and for your project. So there's a big cost and time and just complexity barrier and uncertainty that will even be a successful endeavor. The project here, the Good Shepherd Permanent Supportive Housing Project, was on the path to pursuing a contract rezone to achieve basically the zoning that we ended up implementing with this legislation last year. So in a sense, they had to invest some time and energy, or they chose to go down that path. But ultimately, it's a perfect example of how future projects will just be able to count on these more flexible development standards rather than having to pursue something like a contract rezone. And then obviously the simplest outcome is when Faithland is available for affordable housing, we're going to get more of it if they use this tool. So I'm just going to flip through some slides that just give you a visual of what this might mean and look like in a few zones that we have that are pretty common in Seattle. So this is a multifamily zone where we currently see townhouses as the primary form for redevelopment. On a typical site, you'd get 4 in this example. They'd be 3 stories tall. They would sell, just as a point of reference, the median townhouse sale price right now is $750,000. Usually when I'm telling people around the country that, they think, wow, that's high. I'm realizing I'm talking to a group in California, so maybe that sounds affordable actually. But it is certainly out of reach for a lot of people in Seattle. The proposal would add an additional floor, lower the density limit. And so what you might get would be a 4-story apartment building, 18 1- and 2-bedroom units. We illustrated some ground floor commercial space that could also be some sort of community space or any number of other uses, but that's not allowed under the existing zoning. That's new flexibility that exists for this type of project. This is a mixed use commercial zone, a 40 foot or 4-story height limit. So a very typical sort of housing above ground floor commercial type of form. This example would be 4 stories with about 60 apartments. This is that example, and we chose it to illustrate for this reason, where we do allow now 3 additional floors up to 75 feet, which obviously maximizes or creates a big increase in the number of housing, but most importantly maximizes the value that's possible with wood frame construction. Here's a single family zone, a corner lot. This is actually a 15,000 square foot lot, so sort of typical of what a lot of religious organizations own. It's larger than a typical single family property. And we've imagined here that it has, a religious facility of some kind and some surface parking. If they were to sell and redevelop that property currently or under existing baseline zoning, you'd just get 3 large detached homes. They'd all be 3,000 square feet in size, give or take. The median sales price is over $1 million for a new single family home. So the proposal allows more units, similar scale of development. So 10 apartments would be one option on just the portion of the site that is surface parking today. So you can kind of see the religious facility is actually preserved in this scenario. On the other hand, if the whole site were redeveloped, 10 units, again, they might be townhomes that are affordable to low-income home buyers if the site were fully redeveloped. So that is the last slide that I have. I've not been monitoring the chat, so I'm going to stop sharing and then I'll look through here if there are any questions. I'll just take the first one here. So environmental concerns, how were they addressed and how is parking managed? Sort of similar questions to some extent because we have to analyze parking as an environmental impact. So a little background on this. Anytime in Washington, when we modify our land use code, we have to go through the State Environmental Policy Act or SEPA process. And the purpose of that is to identify probable environmental impacts across a range of different topics. Parking is included, but also height, bulk, and scale, sort of aesthetic impacts, climate, air quality, water quality, et cetera. So one of the sort of decision points when we're doing that is issuing a determination. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but the key point is really significant proposals go through a full environmental impact statement process, which usually involves a consultant team, costs a lot of money, adds a lot of time. The alternative is to do a more streamlined documentation that's done at a staff level, and then issue a determination of non-significance. And the key thing is that that's an appealable decision. And I know California operates in the context of CEQA, so probably some of this is, analogous to things that you go through there. This is also true for a project, but for a legislative proposal like this, in recent years, we've had some of those determinations of non-significance appealed, and then we go through this adjudication process, and often, in a few instances, had to go back and do an EIS after the fact. So for this legislation, we issued a determination of non-significance, and it was not appealed. That's really the short answer to that question. So if the group is curious, I can share the SEPA checklist that we prepared where we discuss environmental impacts. It sort of goes back to that principle that religious property is pretty dispersed throughout the city. This is not something where we expect a rapid, concentrated shift in development patterns that are already underway and that are already analyzed through our comprehensive plan. We really see this as being a small, at a citywide scale, a small change. In many cases, probably adding housing on sites that would redevelop anyway. And with it all being affordable housing too. So concerns about, potential displacement or other equity impacts are minimized or mitigated because of that. Feel free if you want to interrupt me and follow up with something I've said, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll just keep ticking through these. Laura had asked, are these apartments large enough for families as well as singles and couples? In the legislation that we proposed and passed, there's nothing that requires anything about unit size. So some projects are, and some that actually have already made use of the tool, really maximize unit count with smaller units. But our Office of Housing, which again, we expect the city to be funding the vast majority, if not all, projects that use this tool, just because that's how affordable housing comes together in our context. And many, many projects that the city funds that are affordable housing have a much larger share of 2 and 3 bedroom units for low-income families specifically. Certainly compared to the broader private market, it's a much bigger share because, market-wide, it's pretty small. So, that we would expect that to continue through projects that are funded with this. Some of these, Donald may be holding his tongue, not interrupting me. Donald obviously can clarify or elaborate. He's got on the ground experience, working with a lot of churches through the Nehemiah Initiative and also developers in his architecture experience. Okay, big question and a little question. Yeah. Go ahead, Donald.
Yeah. I was going to just say that, many of our churches, something that we've done that I'll talk about in my presentation too, is when they go through the financial analysis and they have a lot of, wishes and desires to have larger units and larger family units, sometimes we find that they're not affordable. So how do we then come to some compromise and saying how many affordable units can we get in that are family friendly and family sized? So that is a push and pull that we work with on the churches now, but the churches do have input into that. And so it's primarily the churches that will say, we want larger units. It's not anything that's controlled by this ordinance or by the city.
Thanks, Donald. Okay, I'll try to get through these quickly. Were there complaints about treating religious congregations differently than other institutional uses or other uses in general? The sort of, the backdrop of having state legislation that required us to do this kind of took a lot of those questions off the table. We were never asked, is a focus on faith organizations the right way to focus? Because that's both the requirement and the authority that the state had given us. We have had conversations, Donald and I, the two of us, have even had conversations about other institutions, and Donald can elaborate on those, but others that might, be really worthy of a similar type of flexibility because of the outcomes that it could produce. I personally agree. I think as a department, we agree and have some ideas in the works currently about how we might build on this as a precedent to expand it. Obviously, probably without the context of state legislation requiring us to do so. And then Philip's question continued, calculating lot area for density purposes as the whole lot, not just the housing portion. In general, yes. I mean, once it gets into actual permitting, the definition of your development site kind of determines what that base is for the purposes of calculating floor area ratio or lot coverage. But in general, if I'm understanding your question, I think the answer would be yes, the property is treated as a whole. One thing that's probably in practice, a decision that projects have to make is if they're preserving an existing religious facility and redeveloping a separate part, they may have to define a different lot to make sure that they're not kind of dinged for the floor area that's in that existing facility. So there, plenty of nuances that come up when it gets down into permitting, but for the purposes of FAR limits, generally, yeah, it's the whole lot. Michael had asked, has there been any reason that the city said no to rezoning religious land? I've worked for the city almost 9 years now. In my experience, this hasn't come up before. There was not a proposal. Again, Donald, interrupt me if you know something I don't, but this was really the first time that I am aware that we took a real look and effort at doing this sort of thing, obviously with the sort of momentum of the state legislation behind us.
And even the Black churches have developed properties before, but generally still under the same allowances granted to everyone.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because actually maybe Michael, if you want to unmute and clarify, that's or sorry, who? Yeah, Michael. Sorry, two Michaels in the chat. Maybe you were asking about the contract rezone process that I had referred to. That's another example where I'm not sure. I mean, there may be. I know there are examples where I think what happens generally is projects get early advice, probably from an attorney that has experience with a contract rezone that says you're very unlikely to be successful with pursuing this contract rezone. And so maybe that kind of stops the process before they even get down the road to eventually be denied. And the main reason that often stalls and never gets off the ground that we hear about, and I was just talking about this a few days ago, is in single family zones specifically, because we have criteria in our land use code and in our comprehensive plan that basically says single family zone land should be preserved. It really should not be rezoned almost under any situation. And we don't have, before this policy, we didn't have anything that would say, except if it's a religious property developing affordable housing. That wasn't some exception. As Donald said, the sort of existing provisions would apply. Question about green space that allows people to mingle and meet one another and build community. We do have, I mean, it's a lot more than I can go in depth into right now, but we do have a lot of other policies in our land use code about green space, about amenity areas that have to be set aside as part of the development. It depends on the zone. All of those apply. So that, what you saw in the slides was sort of the new flexibility that these projects have. But a lot of those other things apply to the redevelopment as well. I think probably another example of where the applicant, i.e., religious organizations that are doing this, would probably want to build in those types of spaces. And again, Donald may be able to elaborate on that. But in most zones, I mean, that's something that we want, not just for projects using this tool, but other affordable housing and other market rate developments. That sort of space is really important. Do we see churches creating mixed income projects, a combination of different income levels? It's a good question as it relates to this legislation, because we talked with some religious organizations that kind of had that in mind. And the short answer is, if they're using this tool, everything that gets a development bonus has to be affordable housing. And so no, you cannot do a mixed income project using this additional height and floor area. There were questions about different sort of ownership structures, like an air rights condominium. And there wasn't really anything that would make that work if you're talking about a vertical arrangement of different income levels. If you have a very large site and you divide it in some way, and you have half of it for affordable and half of it for market rate, that could work. obviously the additional height would apply only on the portion of the site that is affordable housing. You're basically treating it as two developments at that point. We've even had some questions about things like, can they share a wall where they meet? And that's probably a level of detail that maybe you don't all need, and we're not even sure we've resolved it yet. But the simple answer is no, this is really about 100% affordable housing at that 80% of AMI limit.
Yeah, we have a church site that we've actually run through the Nehemiah studio as a test site that has 3 parts to it. And one part is the lower density apartment building. The other is a seniors building that is affordable and makes use of the additional allowances for the 80% and under AMI. But one site is a market rate. And the church has decided with the financial analysis to sacrifice the additional allowances that you would get for affordability to bring in income from the market rate building to subsidize the other projects.
So there's a really important question that I think it's important to ask before we move on to our next speaker, and has to do with some of the churches that we're working with that have affordable housing already on their site. And so they do not want to displace. And so they want to be able to have some of those units that would be non-restricted that they could offer to church members or people living there. So has there been any provisions for anything like that?
That's interesting. I'm recalling one organization we talked to who is a little bit different situation, but they have housing today, and we're looking, it's already income restricted housing, so it wasn't quite the same situation. Their conundrum though was they want to redevelop, and we're, you know, like you're saying, looking for ways to avoid having to displace those existing residents. There's no provision, and I don't think we could have included one that would have created or carved out some flexibility to deviate from that income threshold. We really had to stay within the guardrails of the state legislation, or I should say we chose to, both because that gave us the clearest path and probably helped us avoid some of those appeals that might have delayed the legislation. But you're raising an important question that projects might face. I could see us, you know, coming back to that, but no, it's not something that's built in to this particular piece of legislation. Obviously, if we step back, the question of addressing displacement, both at a project level and more broadly, is another whole conversation, but something certainly we work on much beyond just faith organizations that might be in that particular situation.
Does that do all the questions? There was one about parking. Did we answer that one?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I mentioned that we had sort of studied parking, and, you know, so at the level of our environmental analysis, our answer basically was, we expect this legislation to have a pretty incremental effect here and there throughout the city. Seattle doesn't require parking for residential development when it's close to frequent transit already. So that covers a good portion of the city. In single family areas, we do require generally one parking space for one unit. And Donna, you might have to correct me, I'm racking my brain. I think we just left that requirement in place. Is that right?
Not for ADUs. There at one time, to do an accessory dwelling unit, you did have to have a parking space for that accessory dwelling unit. No longer.
Yes, that's true. So another hat I've worn is spending more time than I probably should on accessory dwelling units. But yeah, we don't require parking for ADUs anymore. I think the key answer here for affordable housing, meaning, you know, income restricted, regulated affordable housing, is that successfully a couple of years ago, we removed the parking requirement for those projects as well. So wherever they are in the city. Now the sort of, I wouldn't say the twist, but, you know, the new opportunity here is that affordable housing, again, because of restrictive zoning, is generally not built in single family areas. So that flexibility hasn't really applied in those areas. But our single family areas also tend to be places with pretty abundant street parking and actually pretty good transit, even to some pretty far-flung neighborhoods. So there's no new requirement, and that existing flexibility to provide less than one unit or one space per unit, or even down to no parking, is still there.
Well, thank you, Nick, for all your information and answering all those questions. I think people are going to have more questions, but we want to get to Donald. So let me introduce him. Donald King is president and CEO of Nehemiah Initiative Seattle. His organization helped to pass the congregational land rezoning measure in Seattle and is helping churches become ready to build affordable housing. Architect, planner, and educator with over 50 years of professional experience in the planning and design of community projects, Donald King has a Master of Architecture degree from UCLA and has been a member of the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects since 2000, and is currently an affiliate professor of architecture in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. So welcome, Donald. We're so glad that you could be with us this evening. And again, for those in the audience, if you have questions while Donald is speaking, please put them in the chat. And with that, Donald, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Bert. I am happy to be here to talk to you about this subject. I've enjoyed listening to some of the conversations already with Nick, and I did chime in a little bit, Nick, so I apologize for that, but hopefully we can have a free-flowing conversation tonight following my presentation. I will get to the chat after the presentation. It'll be a little difficult for me to respond to it during. So I'll try to get through this quickly. Of course, now I've got to find my file. Let's see.
Well, he's looking for that. I just want to thank you for your good questions. You guys had some excellent questions, and feel free to continue to ask away.
Yeah, I see what happened is I had gone through this earlier. So let's see if I can get this enlarged and start the slideshow.
I tried to answer a few of the basics in our chat. So if there's terms you don't understand, don't be shy. Feel free just to ask away.
Okay. Well, the Nehemiah Initiative in Seattle, it's a faith-based community development initiative. And a faith-based development initiative is not only a term that we use in Seattle for the Nehemiah Initiative, but it is a national movement as well. So what you're doing is really connected to a movement that is national and initiatives that are happening in other cities. So I'm sure Dr. Shook knows that from writing the book on it, but it is something noteworthy to speak of, because it is an issue and a challenge that we have with gentrification throughout the country in central cities, particularly those cities that have become more attractive for urban life and urban living. And wanted to go through some of that background before we actually got to the points of the zoning and how the zoning allowances has impacted our ability to one, retain our Black institutions in Seattle, but also retain the members and the population that support those institutions. Nehemiah is the name given by our founder, Bishop Gary Tyson of the Goodwill Missionary Baptist Church in Seattle, and really found it appropriate, as Nehemiah was a person in the 16th book of the Bible, Nehemiah, that had returned from Babylon to help rebuild the Second Temple in Jerusalem with other Israelites that had been displaced from their native land. And Nehemiah is a story about the building of primarily the gates and the walls for the temple, but more importantly, the story of building community as well, and the challenges that Nehemiah faced in doing that. So let's zoom forward now about 3,000 years to more current American history, and that is the history from the turn of the 20th century and the Great Migration of African Americans fleeing the South as refugees from the repression and terrorism of the Jim Crow era South for northern, Midwest, and even Western urban centers. I'm telling you this because this really sets the context for what we now know of as urban centers being synonymous with being the home of African Americans. So for more than 100 years now, African Americans have built community in urban centers, and just recently have been faced with this challenge of displacement caused by gentrification, the rising rates of rents and costs of housing in urban centers due to the attractiveness of city life for those that can afford to pay more. This is nothing new to a lot of you, but again, that migration into Seattle really built Black community in Seattle, not by choice alone, but also by racial covenants and sometimes even governmental restrictions on where Black people could live in the city. So Seattle African Americans built a community in central Seattle, known primarily as the Central District. The Central District is the largest enclave of African Americans north of San Francisco. The population, the Black population of Seattle is still the largest population of African Americans north of San Francisco. But the specific neighborhood that was segregated by racial covenants and by law in many cases really was part of the city of Seattle's districts. So the Central District was a district within the city and easily identifiable as that too. So the Black church was part of this community that was built. The Black church, following the history of nearly 300 years of a church of social justice, of the gospel of freedom. And it was the safe place for African Americans to organize around political activity and around community building. And the largest service provider of African Americans in almost any city, specifically in Seattle. I won't tell you the full story of redlining. I'm sure most of you know about it, but this area in red here is also the same area that is defined as the Central District of Seattle. So with its majority Black population, it was subject to redlining and being considered hazardous by the Federal Home Loan Bank back in the mid-30s that restricted lending and investment and insurance to properties and property owners, if there were any owners in this area. So it generally meant that this restriction left many without the ability to purchase more property, make improvements to their homes, or make improvements to their communities, to their businesses, and for churches also to have that same level of limits in making investments in their property. So the changing face of Seattle Central District here is an older data file. We have some more recent information from the census now that in around 1970, the Central District was about 73% Black. By 2014, it had gone down to 18%. In 2022, it's more like 12%.
Wow.
So a fairly rapid and an accelerating loss of Black community. Here you can see a little bit more of that area that we call the central area, and the redlined area it being the same. Where it is within the city central in Seattle, this is downtown Seattle. So you can see why this area was so popular, that become to be so popular. For decades, it was a no-go zone. I have white friends that say, I never go there or never would go there. That has changed. The fear of being in the Black community now has gone away. And it's gone away in many cities in and across the country that have really seen gentrification take hold. Here's a very, physical, in your face presentation of what gentrification looks like. It is not only just the numbers that have changed, the demographics that have changed, the income level, the racial difference, but a lot of the cultural difference, a lot of the change in how the neighborhood even looks and how it feels for some of the older residents there, feeling unwelcome, feeling new. A lot of it intentional to turn that over. The Black church being, again, that anchor in the Black community itself became threatened as residents began to leave and lose homes, lose affordable rents, and leave the city sometimes for 20, 30 miles outside of the city, even if they still worked in the city. If you were a school teacher or a firefighter or any entry-level professional person, you could no longer afford to live in Seattle. The church was the anchor. The church still is that place for many people to return to on Sundays, driving, 10, 20, 30 miles to be there. So the church was a place that we started to pay attention to because we'd seen homes go, and so homes would go in individual transactions, and you would sell your home. You would sell your home and you would make maybe a pretty good profit from the home, but you could no longer live in Seattle because you would never make enough to buy another piece of property in Seattle. So now you've sold this home that you may have paid somewhere in the mid 50s for. Homes now in my neighborhood where our home cost $68,000. Both sides of us, the homes are $1 million to $2 million. So we now live among millionaires, and we weren't millionaires to purchase this home. So if we sold, we would have to leave the city. Businesses that then catered to the Black population lost their patrons. They closed. The next were institutions, including the church, losing congregation, also began to close or sell their property and leave, and trying to find a place in the diaspora of African Americans that were now spread out mostly throughout South King County and into Pierce County, a neighboring county to the south, in various locations. So many churches were trying to find a place to move to that was more central. That idea was gone now. The city was central. So many churches also came to grips with the idea that we want to stay. We need to find a way to stay. And how can we do that? Well, churches, being churches, were blessed. They were blessed with property. They were blessed with property that they had purchased with cash because in the redlined communities, they weren't able to get loans in their churches. As late as 1974, the largest Black church in Seattle could not get a loan to build their new sanctuary. So they went back out to their community, back out to their congregation, and built that new sanctuary with cash. Wow. During the Boeing bust of the 1970s, many churches purchased property, again, by raising money from their congregation with cash. So these are truly community-owned properties. These are community-owned properties that are debt-free, that have underdeveloped property. We have estimated that among the churches in Seattle that own property is somewhere in the area of $200 million in value and 12 to 15 acres, enough to produce 1,000, 1,500 affordable housing units. So why not develop? Was the mantra that we took to a lot of the churches. If we take a look at First African Methodist Episcopal Church, the oldest Black church in Seattle, founded in, I believe it was 1884. there's something that you notice right away in aerial photos of Seattle's central city. Anytime you see this much open property, it's most likely, it's not a school, it's going to be a church. This is their parking lot. This is their parking lot that they've hoped to preserve for parking for those people that had to drive for 30 miles into service. It no longer made sense for them when they were struggling to survive. So First African Methodist Episcopal Church, First AME, or FAME as we call it, has over an acre of land, 49,000 square feet of land, but only 24,000 of that is used for buildings. Mount Zion Baptist Church, 110,000 square feet of land, the second oldest church and the largest church, largest Black church in Seattle. Only 57,000 square feet of it, or 57,000 square feet of it is used for parking of that 110,000 square feet. You can see these open parking spaces. This is the church, by the way, that I just talked about that had to raise money in 1974 from their congregation to build this new sanctuary. So again, these churches are not only blessed with property and highly valued. This is the church's property that they actually sold, a few years ago. This was a property that they developed a few years ago. Nothing in the central campus have they developed yet. But this is a major arterial in Seattle. This is Madison Street. When you look at these neighborhoods, you find out there very intense development going on in the neighborhoods. They're highly valued properties, and the churches are beset weekly by developers that want to buy their property. And it was that developer that started the conversation with Bishop Gary Tyson when he wanted to buy the property from Goodwill Missionary Baptist Church and launching the Nehemiah Initiative. The Nehemiah Initiative, as I said, what is a faith-based development initiative. We are not developers, but we support development of church property and support the churches in many ways: financial support, technical support, finding ways that they can develop their property, finding means through the McKinley Future Studio at the University of Washington, and being able to test the concept of developing their property sites. We have done 3 of these studios so far within the last 3 years, and 9 church sites. So 3 church sites each quarter that we've done this studio. This has been done primarily because these churches are property rich, but they're cash poor. They are really hanging on, but with the loss of congregation, a loss of offerings and tithings from a shrinking congregation, but still with the will that they want to hang on and want to stay in Seattle. How do we do that? Well, one of the ways we can do that is we can develop their property without them losing their property, without them losing their church, and develop affordable housing that they can offer for their congregation and other members of their community, to retain members of the community, to retain members of their congregation. So the Nehemiah Studio, here's a couple of students here working on some financial analysis. The Nehemiah Studio, it's an interdisciplinary studio of architecture, landscape architecture, urban design and planning students, and real estate students. So we do visioning, we do site capacity studies, we do financial analysis for these sites, which then gives the church leadership the confidence and the background and the information that they need to, one, demystify the development process, and to let them know that they can build on their property, including in this particular church, a church within a senior's apartment building. So a number of ways that we looked at development. Here is a property that is so large that it will have 3 zones to it. One zone that is going to be the larger mixed use building, that it is in a zone that is a 75-foot high zone. Now it can go to 95 foot with the additional land use allowances that Nick talked about. An intermediate zone here of low-rise housing that can be smaller apartment buildings, and could be possibly condominiums and home ownership. Then the lower area that can be townhomes and even cottages on this end of the site that is adjacent to a single family neighborhood. So a number of ideas that we've come up with through the studio to give these churches a vision of what they can do with their property, and also a test of the land use ordinance as it was being drafted. We worked with Nick. Nick came into studio. We took a look at, what can be done to possibly tweak the drafting of the ordinance in a test of concept in the studio. That feasibility for the project could provide additional units, but also show some return to the church to keep it being well to continue to do good. So here's an example that we were going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to save this for some Q&A, but looking at a Seattle residential small lot zone and what the additional allowances can do for that, really going from 4 floors to 5 floors, 300 or 3,000 square foot floor area ratio, 3,000 square feet per floor plate, to 6,000 square feet per floor plate, doubling the area that can be covered on a floor through an increase of the floor area ratio. The criteria for some of this is also written into the land use code amendment. Sometimes there's minimum lot sizes. It all has to be a religious owned property, but in this case, it has to be abutted by a religious facility. And of course, the property would need to be owned by a faith-based institution for 50 years. So I will end that part of my presentation, and I'd be happy to engage with you in some conversation and any questions that you have on what I just presented. You'd heard from Nick about the land use ordinance. That has been very, very important to us, along with the other, I would say, providential blessings that the church has had by somehow having this property, purchasing this property with cash, owning this property debt-free, having this property in central cities at a time when that was the cheapest place to buy property, the Black neighborhood, and now being able to save itself from that investment without knowing that that was going to be the investment that they were making. So this has really been a just outcome to a very unjust set of circumstances that the Black community and the Black churches had to go through.
So Donald, it looks like we have some questions for you. This was an excellent presentation. You unpacked the redlining and all of the exclusionary policies in such a clear way. And we have the same exact thing happening here in our city. And so I think you've made it very clear. And it's not just Pasadena, it's in a number of cities throughout Southern California. So there's a question here. Do you want to take this question and present it, Bert? The ones from Phil?
Yeah, sure. So Phil wanted to know how it's been working with students. Let me read his actual question. Well, how's your experience been working with students to provide these services? We'd love to hear more about a typical process.
Oh, yeah. This has been great. The students are great because they're not burdened with many of the negative, words in our ear about, no, you can't do it. This won't work. You know, working with churches is difficult. They hadn't really taken that into account when they began this work, and they found that this work was very rewarding. Many have said it's really the best studio and the best course that they've had an experience with in their time at the university. And these are graduate students.
Wow.
So it's been great experience for the students, working with real clients, working in community, working on something that is as value laden as these projects have been. And we've learned a lot from the students. The students have learned a lot from us.
And so Phil continues, well, I guess this is a second question. We'd love to hear more about a typical process for the Nehemiah Studio and walking a church from a mere thought to a completed project.
Yeah. You know, first of all, the students learn a lot about, they learn a little of that history that I've given you. They learn a lot about the history of the Black community, how it wound up being an urban community in the last century, how the Black church has been the center of that community. Now, think about this. A number of our students are international students, you know, Asian students, some from China, that had no experience with working in a Black community before, and very little knowledge of that history in detail. So they also weren't burdened with, you know, some of the negativity that would come with this. So they were open to this. They were providing us with a fresh look and a fresh experience in doing this. So we would start with that background, with that history, with the context of the neighborhood, what was happening in the neighborhood. And we would have them do a deep dive into all the demographics, the history. Many would create a timeline of events to have an understanding of how we got to where we are. Because there's the rather cynical comment that people will have, particularly around gentrification, on, you know, well, why didn't you just buy more property when you could have? And there is an answer for that. And there's an understanding that people are now coming to learn that there were restrictions on that for African Americans. And unlike other Americans that could take advantage of that had the privilege of being able to just go to the bank and get a loan.
So we've got, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've got only about a minute or two left, and we have two really important questions. If you could quickly answer. So Andre White had the question in terms of Black brown developers having a priority and in order to empower them. Can you speak to that? And then also, it's very important that you talk about some poison pills in this policy. And what it was that you all did with Nehemiah to help address those poison pills. Thanks.
Sure. So the answer to the idea of this part of what we're trying to do is be more inclusionary in our selection, and also our mentoring and building opportunities for more Black and brown developers, more Black and brown architects, builders, in what we do. So when we say building beloved community, we include that inclusion and building more economic growth in our community as well, in the provision of this affordable housing. We're getting also help from Amazon and the local initiative support corporation LISC on creating a cohort of young developers that I am one of the mentors for, in being able to do not only these projects, but other projects in the community. Let's see. So the other question,
poison pills,
poison pill, So in the process of being able to get this ordinance passed through the city council, there's some political background to it. I won't share all of that with you, but there were those that felt that at 80% of area median income, somehow churches were going to take advantage of that and only build to the highest level of area median income and exclude those, the bulk of that community that may be 60% or below. It was not our intent at all. But in the last day of the council proceedings and conversations, a couple of council members introduced a 60% AMI maximum before passing the legislation. And the legislation passed at that. When the mayor's office called and asked if I would be there for the signing of it, I said, no, I won't. This was not the legislation that we wanted passed. So we began a campaign and got more of our churches involved in that campaign to reverse that poison pill amendment. And many council members have told me they've never done this before, but we were able to get that changed. And we were able to amend the amendment in 2 months through our campaign to get that going.
Amazing.
And
Wow.
I was at the mayor's signing for that.
Wow. So I hope you all understand why that's so important, because you have to have at 80% that the higher end units help to offset the cost of the lower income units. And without that, the churches would not have been able to do the development. So thank you, Donald. You were amazing in organizing and pulling groups together that quickly to get a good policy at the city level. So that takes a lot of courage. So
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Donald and Nick, for both your presentations. And yeah, that is an amazing story at the end. I wish we could hear more about that, that the city passed an ordinance that didn't work and you had to come back at them a second time to get them to do one that will work, because that's kind of what we're up against. And I want everybody to understand that here in Pasadena is what has been proposed by the planning department won't really work. It won't produce much. And we need to get one that will work. And so that's kind of the strategy of those that don't want this to work. They want to put a number of things in there. So we're going to have a strategy meeting for those that are able to make it. It's going to be in person at the Orange Grove Quaker Meeting House, Orange Grove Friends Meeting House on July 5th, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. We'll provide dinner, but let us know if you're coming so we can figure that out. And I believe, Jill, you're taking the RSVPs on that, right? Is that you? Or
yeah,
in
fact, if you're wanting to come, if you could let me know right now through chat, that'd be very helpful. And we'll be having experts help us understand what it is we do need to propose to make this policy work. So it's a little technical, but there'll be plenty of time to really dive into it and understand it in detail. It'll give you a lot of confidence in knowing how to speak on the 11th, and how to write letters too. So,
and we see that it can be done. They did it in Seattle. It's a much bigger fish than Pasadena, and they had the same kind of, underhanded tactics being used there. So we can do it here, but we have to pull together. And so we need you if you're willing to make public testimony or write emails or both. But we need you, if you're willing to make public testimony, if you can make it on July 5th at the Orange Grove Friends Meeting House, 5 to 7 p.m. and we'll provide dinner.
I'm putting my email in here, so you all can just email me as well if you plan to attend. I would appreciate let us know. It's really a very special place to meet in the Quaker Meeting House. If you've never been there before, it's a 100-year-old building, a lot of history, and so that alone is worth coming.
Yes. So at this point, we want to show a 2-minute video that we recently created. And so, Anthony, do you have that ready to go?
Yes, I do.
All right.
Let me stop share. Actually, I have to make sure that I press this little sound button so it actually works. Okay, so this is our website, and Our video is the one right here.
Our city and state are facing a growing housing and homelessness crisis. But we know that there are solutions if we're willing to take action. For over 10 years, this city-owned land in Pasadena was vacant. For 9 months, we advocated for affordable housing. And now there will be a groundbreaking for 69 units of affordable housing for unhoused seniors. For decades, this city-owned land was vacant. Soon there will be 111 units of affordable housing right next to our magnificent City Hall, thanks to our advocacy. Church parking lots are often underutilized. With our partner, Foothill Unity Center, we have launched the first safe parking program in the San Gabriel Valley. Today, our unhoused neighbors can sleep safely in their cars and are on the path to becoming permanently housed. Our goal is to have safe parking programs throughout the San Gabriel Valley. We have 56 churches interested in having affordable housing built on their underutilized land, and we anticipate them planning for 1,000 units in the next year. At Making Housing and Community Happen, we are transforming cities, churches, and lives through affordable housing. Pasadena has reduced its homeless count by 56%, from 1,216 in 2011 to 527 in 2020. Our goal is to end chronic homelessness and ensure that there is decent and affordable housing for all who need it. You are invited to join us. So we did that on a shoestring. That was pretty good, huh? I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to do our team reports. Let me start from the current beginning slide. There we go. What's happening at MHCH, or our team report? So Making Housing and Community Happen, we have a very, very small staff, but we have more than 50 volunteers, and they work on 4 different teams. And I'm going to look at each of those teams. Actually, I'm going to look at 5. I'm going to add in a 5th team. So we have our safe parking program. There are about 15,000 people living in their vehicles in Los Angeles County. And until recently, there was no safe parking program in the San Gabriel Valley. But as you saw in the video, as of April 1st, 2021, we helped launch the first safe parking program in the San Gabriel Valley. So we have, in that program, we have 5 places to park, access to a bathroom, case management services, and referrals to job placement and permanent housing. So already several people have been permanently housed through this program, and we are expanding to other San Gabriel Valley sites. So we're expanding to El Monte, and we're already putting out a call for volunteers there. Glendora, we're putting out a call for volunteers there. Arcadia, Temple City, La Puente, we need volunteers, and Baldwin Park. So we're expanding to all of these, but El Monte, Glendora, and La Puente, we're at a point where we want to get volunteers. So if you are able to do that or know people, we need volunteers for those 3 cities. So if you want to volunteer, contact Wendy McGrail. You can contact her by email, wendybmcgrail@gmail.com. Just contact her by email if you want to volunteer. So if you want to make a referral to the safe parking program for someone who's living in their car, then contact Myra Bueno. That's Myra. You can contact her by email or phone. Email is myra@foothillunitycenter.org. The phone number is 626-358-3486. And that's if you want to refer someone who is living in their car. We also have our congregational land team. That's what we've been talking about tonight. And they consult with congregations to build affordable housing. They're in discussions or have had discussions with 65 congregations and just completed the first educational cohort of congregations who will be going on to further consultation to get them ready to have affordable housing on their land. But of course, the zoning is the biggest problem we run into. So we're also working on overlay zones in Pasadena, as we've been talking about, but also in Sierra Madre and Yorba Linda. I mentioned that those are the first two towns in California to have overlay zones. That's because of the chair of our Congregational Land Committee, Phil Burns. He did the work in those cities. He did the overlay zones in those cities. And he's also gotten the overlay zone, religious overlay zone, into the housing elements of a number of cities here in Southern California. In addition, we are working with a state coalition to get an overlay zone that will cover the whole state of California. That's right now, that's AB Assembly Bill 1336 that would give an overlay zone for religious land in California. Also, our affordable and supportive housing advocates, ASHA. In the video, it mentioned their two of their biggest successes recently. They won approval of 69 units of permanent supportive housing for seniors experiencing homelessness at Heritage Square South, the corner of Fair Oaks and Orange Grove, where Church's Chicken used to be. So that's now going to be 69 units of permanent supportive housing for seniors experiencing homelessness, and ground is going to break for that ceremonially. They're going to have a ceremonial groundbreaking because it's going to be indoors. It's just ceremonial, but they're going to have a ceremonial groundbreaking on July 6th. And very few people are invited to attend by the city, but the rest of us are going to have a party afterwards. We're going to meet at California Pizza Kitchen to celebrate the groundbreaking of 69 units at Heritage Square South. Also, they, as you saw in the video, they won 111 units. This committee won 111 units of affordable senior housing, 10% of it permanent supportive housing for people, seniors that have been experiencing homelessness. And that's right in our civic center. So that was our more recent victory. And that's an artist rendering of it. You can see right there, the beige part, that's the artist rendering of what it will look like. The white part's already there. So at this point, ASHA is helping us with the rezoning religious land in Pasadena campaign. Also, it's been working with some of our partners and coalition on Pasadena's housing element. A housing element is what every city in California is required to have to plan housing for the next 8 years to make sure everyone gets housed. And what's normally happened is cities haven't taken it seriously. And so their plans, their housing elements haven't been very good. So ASHA has been working in coalition with some of our partners to make sure that Pasadena has a good housing element that actually works and actually can start housing more people in our city. So they've also been working on transitional housing initiatives as well as rent control. This is also in coalition with the Pasadena Tenants Coalition. We finally got rent control on the ballot. So in November, rent control is going to be on the ballot. That's after 20 years of off and on attempts to get that to happen. We finally have it on the ballot, so we need to get people to vote for it. That's one of our major victories. So then we have our strategy rezoning for the July 11th council meeting to rezone a religious land. It's going to be on the city council on July 11th. So Tuesday, July 5th, 5 to 7 p.m. Dinner provided at the Orange Grove Friends Meeting House. That's 520 East Orange Grove Boulevard. So Community Land Trust. So the Community Land Trust team has incorporated as the San Gabriel Valley Community Land Trust. They are now their own 501c3, their own nonprofit. So they are no longer officially part of us. We have given birth to them, but we have spun them off. For those who don't know what a community land trust is, community land trusts make home ownership more affordable by letting people buy a house without having to buy the land, because the land is owned by a nonprofit, and that keeps the housing affordable in perpetuity. So that's what a community land trust is. It helps people get into home ownership who otherwise wouldn't be able to do that. So the San Gabriel Valley Community Land Trust will be the first one in the San Gabriel Valley. There are already some in LA, but in the San Gabriel Valley, we don't have one yet. It'll be the first one. So North Fair Oaks Empowerment Team. This is a group of churches on North Fair Oaks that is working to beautify and not gentrify North Fair Oaks. So you can see North Fair Oaks pictured here. They want to do that with more signage, more trees, more sidewalk repairs, and affordable housing. Some of them are interested in having affordable housing on their land, what we've been talking about. They've also joined and partnered with the Complete Streets Coalition to create something called Complete Streets, which makes the streets accessible not just for cars, but for pedestrians and cyclists and people using other modes of transportation. They've also started something called the 20%ers group, which is for people who've been displaced from Pasadena, who want to come back. They are meeting together regularly to strategize and support each other. And it's named after the policy in Pasadena, which sets aside 20% of affordable housing prioritized for people who have been displaced, which is a recent, there was a policy that was passed within the last couple of years. We also have a congregational network of more than 20 congregations that participate in MHCH. If you want your congregation to be in the network, then contact me. That's my work. That's what I do. Bert Newton, bert@makinghousinghappen.org is my email, or you can call or text me at 626-993-7958. That's 626-993-7958. And that concludes our presentation, our committee reports. So now Jill is going to say a few words to bring this meeting to a close, and then we can stick around and talk for those who want to stick around.
Yes, I just have a quick statement I'd like to share. I wanted to share that 22 years ago here on this property, I planted an avocado tree, and it is producing hundreds of avocados. And it was about that same time that we were called AHA, Affordable Housing Action, and we were imagining an inclusionary housing policy that would enable every single development in the city of Pasadena that's 10 units or more, that would set aside 15% of their units as affordable. In 2019, we were able to increase that to 20%. And that has produced over 590 units embedded in high-end housing throughout our city, which is just amazing to me. Talk about abundance. Our ADU, our Granite Black Committee, we've put that to bed, just like we have our inclusionary, since we've accomplished our goals. That committee started in 2003. And after struggling with trying to get anything passed locally, we went to the state. And today you can have not just one, but 2 ADUs pretty much on every home site in our state. 3 years ago, we started our nonprofit, Making Housing and Community Happen. And we began to imagine even more and new teams. And so our more recent team, the newest team, is the one you've heard about tonight, the Congregational Land Committee. And just imagine, we now have, as Bert mentioned, over 56 churches now coming to us for help, just like the way that Donald has shared tonight. We are not working with the university, which is very appealing to us. We'd like to learn from Donald and continue to grow, but without any advertisement, these churches are coming for support and help. And so we're just reminded everywhere. When I walk into my backyard and I see all those avocados, I think of God's amazing abundance and how God is multiplying this work. And you are helping us tonight. You have made our joy complete by being part of our evening housing justice forum this evening. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. And so we're going to end the recording, and then feel free to leave and feel free to stick around if you wish to just ask further questions or share what you'd like to share. Thank you so much.